The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George walked alongside his protection officer, James Mitchell. James had been assigned to the young prince for nearly 3 years, and their relationship had grown from professional duty to genuine care. The seasoned guard, a former military man with 20 years of royal protection experience, had never encountered a child quite like George. George possessed an unusual quality for someone his age. While other children might throw tantrums or demand attention, the young prince observed the world around him with quiet intensity. His teachers often remarked on his ability to notice things others missed, and his gentle nature towards staff members had earned him respect throughout the royal household. On this particular Tuesday morning, James noticed something different about the prince. George seemed more thoughtful than usual, his blue eyes scanning the faces of every person they passed. The boy had always been perceptive, but today his attention appeared focused on something specific. "Your Highness, is everything all right?" James asked as they made their way toward the private gardens where George would spend his morning studying with his tutor. George paused mid-step and turned to face his protector. The boy's expression was serious, far beyond his years. "James, may I ask you something personal?" The guard was taken aback. In all their time together, the prince had never requested such a conversation. "Of course, Your Highness. What's on your mind? You seem tired lately, really tired, and sometimes your hands shake when you think no one is looking." George's voice was gentle but direct. "Are you feeling sick?" James felt his chest tighten. The young prince had noticed what he thought he had been hiding so well. For months, James had been struggling with severe anxiety and depression, following a traumatic incident during a previous assignment. The sleepless nights, the constant worry, the overwhelming sense of responsibility for the prince's safety had been eating away at him. He had convinced himself that he was managing it well enough to continue his duties. "I'm fine, Your Highness. Just a bit under the weather," James replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. George studied his face for a long moment. The boy had inherited his grandmother's ability to read people, and James's deflection was transparent to him. "You don't have to pretend with me, James. I know when people are hurting." The simple honesty in the child's voice nearly broke James's composure. Here was a 10-year-old boy showing more emotional intelligence than most adults. The guard realized that his attempts to hide his struggles had been futile, at least from someone as observant as Prince George. As they continued their walk, George began sharing stories about times when he had felt overwhelmed or scared. He spoke about the pressure he sometimes felt knowing that people were always watching him, and how his parents had taught him that it was okay to feel difficult emotions. The prince's words were wise beyond his years, delivered with a maturity that surprised even James. "My father once told me that the strongest people are those who know when to ask for help," George said as they reached the garden entrance. He said that real courage isn't about never being afraid or never feeling bad. It's about being honest when you're struggling and letting people who care about you help. James found himself genuinely listening, not just hearing the words but feeling their impact. This child, who had every reason to be self-centered or demanding, was instead showing compassion and wisdom that many adults never developed. The guard began to understand that his own struggles were not just affecting him but were visible to someone who depended on him for protection and guidance. The conversation continued as they settled into the garden study area. George's tutor hadn't arrived yet, giving them a few more minutes alone. The prince picked up a small stone from the path and examined it carefully before speaking again. "James, I want you to know that I trust you completely. You've always kept me safe and you've been kind to me, but I also want you to be safe and healthy too." The boy's words carried a weight that seemed impossible for someone his age. Sometimes I think adults forget that children notice things. "We see when you're sad or worried or scared." The guard felt tears threatening to surface. In all his years of service, through dangerous assignments and high-stress situations, he had never been moved the way this conversation was affecting him. Prince George wasn't just being polite or following some royal protocol. The child genuinely cared about his well-being, and that realization was both humbling and overwhelming. As the morning progressed and George's tutor arrived, James found himself reflecting on the prince's words. The boy had managed to communicate something profound without being preachy or demanding. He had simply spoken his truth with kindness and wisdom, creating a moment of connection that would stay with James long after their conversation ended. That evening, as James completed his shift and prepared to head home, he realized that something fundamental had shifted in his perspective. The young prince had shown him a different way of looking at strength and vulnerability, and for the first time in months, James began to consider that perhaps seeking help wasn't a sign of weakness after all. The following week brought a series of public engagements that would test James's ability to maintain his professional composure while dealing with his personal struggles. Prince George was scheduled to attend a charity event at a local children's hospital, followed by a visit to a community center where he would participate in activities with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. James had always prided himself on his ability to blend into the background during such events, providing security while allowing the prince to interact naturally with the public. However, his recent conversations with George had left him feeling exposed and uncertain about his emotional state. As they arrived at the children's hospital, James noticed how effortlessly Prince George connected with the young patients. The boy had a natural ability to make others feel comfortable, asking genuine questions about their interests and sharing appropriate stories about his own experiences. Watching the prince interact with children who were facing serious health challenges, James was struck by the boy's maturity and empathy. During one particularly touching moment, George sat beside a 7-year-old girl who was recovering from surgery. The little girl was shy and seemed overwhelmed by meeting a real prince. Instead of trying to force conversation, George simply sat quietly with her, occasionally making gentle comments about the drawings on her bedside table. "I like to draw too," George told her softly. "Sometimes when I'm worried about something, drawing helps me feel better." "Do you feel that way too?" The girl nodded and began showing George her artwork. James watched from his position near the door, amazed by the prince's intuitive understanding of how to communicate with someone who was vulnerable and scared. The boy's approach was natural and unforced, creating a sense of genuine connection rather than performative charity. As the hospital visit continued, James found himself studying Prince George's interactions more closely. The child seemed to possess an unusual ability to read situations and respond appropriately. When faced with a group of excited teenagers, George was playful and engaging. With younger children, he was gentle and patient. When speaking with worried parents, he was respectful and thoughtful. The guard began to realize that the prince's behavior during their private conversation had not been an isolated incident. This level of emotional intelligence and empathy was simply part of who George was as a person. The boy genuinely cared about the well-being of others, regardless of their age or social status. Later that afternoon at the community center, James witnessed another example of the prince's remarkable character. A group of teenagers from troubled backgrounds had been invited to participate in sports activities with George. Some of the young people seemed suspicious and unimpressed by the royal visit, clearly viewing it as a publicity stunt. George seemed to sense their skepticism immediately. Instead of trying to win them over with charm or special treatment, he simply participated in the activities with genuine enthusiasm. When he missed a shot during a basketball game, he laughed at himself. When others made good plays, he offered sincere congratulations. Gradually, the teenagers began to warm up to him, not because he was a prince, but because he was treating them as equals. One boy, who had been particularly standoffish, eventually approached George during a break. James positioned himself close enough to ensure security but tried to give them privacy for their conversation. "You're not what I expected," the teenager admitted to George. "Most rich people who come here act like they're doing us some big favor." "You just seem like a normal person," George smiled. "I am a normal person. I just happen to have been born into an unusual family. But that doesn't make me any different from you on the inside. We all have feelings and worries and things we care about." The simplicity and honesty of the prince's response clearly resonated with the boy. They continued talking about school sports and shared interests, with George showing genuine curiosity about the teenager's life and experiences. As James observed these interactions throughout the day, he began to understand something important about the prince's earlier conversation with him. George's concern for his well-being hadn't been motivated by obligation or training. The boy simply possessed a natural inclination to care about others and to notice when they were struggling. This realization was both comforting and concerning for James. On one hand, It meant that George's words had come from a place of genuine care. On the other hand, it made James more aware of how his own emotional state might be affecting someone who was naturally attuned to the feelings of others. During the drive back to Windsor Castle, George was unusually quiet. James could see the boy processing the day's experiences, his expression thoughtful and slightly sad. "The children at the hospital were very brave," George finally said. "It must be scary to be so sick and have to stay away from home." "Yes, Your Highness. They showed remarkable courage today," James agreed. "And the teenagers at the community center," George continued. "Some of them seemed angry, but I think they might just be sad about things in their lives." The guard was once again struck by the prince's perceptive nature. Many adults would have missed the underlying emotions that George had identified so clearly. "You handled both situations very well today," James told him honestly. "You have a gift for making people feel comfortable and understood." George turned to look at him directly. "Do you think that's why it's important for people to be honest about their feelings, so that others can understand and help?" The question hung in the air between them, and James realized that the prince was still thinking about their earlier conversation about seeking help and acknowledging struggles. The boy was continuing to offer wisdom and encouragement, but in his characteristic gentle and indirect way. The weekend brought a welcome break from public duties, allowing Prince George to spend time in the private family quarters of Windsor Castle. James maintained his security duties but found these quieter periods more challenging than busy public schedules. Without the distraction of events and activities, his anxiety seemed to intensify, and the sleepless nights were beginning to take a serious toll on his physical health. On Saturday morning, James arrived for his shift feeling particularly exhausted. He had managed only 2 hours of sleep, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios and overwhelming feelings of inadequacy. As he took his position outside the family breakfast room, he fought to maintain his professional composure while battling the familiar symptoms of panic that had been plaguing him for months. Prince George emerged from breakfast earlier than usual, carrying a book about astronomy that he had been reading for a school project. The boy immediately noticed James's pale complexion and the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his earpiece. "Good morning, James," George said cheerfully, but his eyes were filled with concern. "Would you like to sit in the garden while I read? The fresh air might be nice." James recognized the suggestion for what it was. The prince was offering him an opportunity to rest while still maintaining the appearance of professional duty. The boy's thoughtfulness was both touching and alarming, as it confirmed that his struggles were becoming increasingly visible despite his efforts to hide them. They settled on a bench in the Queen's private garden, with George opening his book, while James positioned himself to maintain visual surveillance of the area. The morning was peaceful, with only the sound of birds and the distant hum of castle activity. For a few minutes, James allowed himself to feel slightly more relaxed. "This book talks about how stars are born and die," George said conversationally, though James suspected the prince was trying to provide a distraction from his obvious distress. "It's fascinating how something so beautiful can come from chaos and darkness." The boy continued reading aloud, his voice calm and steady. James found himself actually listening to the content, drawn in by George's genuine enthusiasm for the subject. The prince had a way of making complex scientific concepts accessible, asking questions that showed he was really thinking about what he was learning. "Do you think people are like stars sometimes?" George asked suddenly, looking up from his book. "I mean, do you think beautiful things can come from difficult or dark times in people's lives?" The question was clearly directed at James, though it was phrased in a way that didn't feel intrusive or demanding. The guard found himself considering the idea seriously. "I think that's possible, Your Highness," James replied carefully, "though I imagine it might be hard to believe when you're going through the difficult times." George nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother once told me that some of the strongest people she knew had been through very hard things. She said that sadness and struggle can teach people to be more understanding and kind to others." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Prince William, who was looking for his son. James immediately stood and assumed his formal posture, but William waved him back to the bench. "Please don't get up on my account," the Prince of Wales said warmly. "George, I see you found a good spot for your reading." "Yes, Papa." "James and I were discussing astronomy and how stars form from cosmic dust and gas," George replied, seamlessly shifting the conversation away from their more personal discussion. William joined them for a few minutes, engaging with George's project and asking James about his thoughts on the morning's security arrangements. The interaction was relaxed and natural, and James was struck by the family's ability to make him feel included rather than simply tolerated as necessary staff. After William left to attend to other matters, George returned to his book but continued to glance at James with obvious concern. The boy seemed to be wrestling with something, opening his mouth to speak several times before deciding against it. "Is there something you'd like to say, Your Highness?" James finally asked. George closed his book and turned to face him fully. "James, I know I'm just a child, and I know there are things about adult life that I don't understand. But I also know when someone I care about is hurting." The simple declaration caught James off guard. The prince had never explicitly stated that he cared about him before, and hearing it expressed so directly was both moving and overwhelming. "I don't want to interfere or make you uncomfortable," George continued, "but I keep thinking about what you would do if you saw me struggling with something serious. You wouldn't just ignore it and hope it got better, would you?" James felt his throat tighten. The boy was right, of course. If Prince George were showing signs of serious emotional distress, James would immediately ensure that he received proper care and support. The parallel was obvious and intentional. "You're very wise for someone your age," James managed to say. "Maybe," George replied with a small smile. "Or maybe I just care about people who are important to me. You've been taking care of me for 3 years, James. You've kept me safe and treated me with kindness. Don't you think you deserve the same kind of care?" The question lingered between them as they sat in the peaceful garden. James realized that Prince George had managed to communicate something profound about responsibility, care, and self-worth without being preachy or demanding. The boy had simply presented a logical argument wrapped in genuine affection and concern. As they prepared to return inside for George's afternoon activities, the prince made one final comment that would stay with James for days to come. "You know, James, I think the bravest thing my parents ever taught me was that asking for help isn't giving up. It's actually the first step toward getting better." The words were spoken casually, as if George were simply sharing an interesting fact about astronomy or history. But James understood that the prince was offering him something precious: permission to acknowledge his struggles and seek the help he desperately needed. Monday morning brought a scheduled security briefing that James had been dreading for weeks. The meeting would include senior protection officers, palace security coordinators, and representatives from the Metropolitan Police. James knew that his recent performance had not gone unnoticed by his supervisors, and he suspected that his fitness for duty would be questioned. As he prepared for the meeting, James's anxiety reached new heights. His hands shook as he reviewed his reports, and he found it difficult to concentrate on even basic tasks. The irony was not lost on him that he was struggling to protect himself while being responsible for protecting one of the most important children in the country. Before the meeting, James had one final shift with Prince George. The boy was scheduled for a private music lesson followed by some outdoor time in the castle grounds. As they walked toward the music room, George seemed unusually chatty, discussing everything from his piano practice to his upcoming school projects. "James, have you ever noticed how music can change the way you feel?" George asked as they paused outside the music room door. "When I'm worried about something, playing piano helps me think more clearly." The observation seemed innocent enough, but James was beginning to recognize the pattern in George's conversations. The boy had a remarkable ability to introduce ideas that were relevant to James's situation without being direct or confrontational about it. "I suppose music can be very therapeutic," James agreed. "My teacher says that when musicians perform together, they have to trust each other completely. Everyone has to do their part, but they also have to support each other when someone makes a mistake." George paused thoughtfully. "She says the best orchestras are the ones where people aren't afraid to admit when they need help with a difficult piece." During the music lesson, James positioned himself where he could maintain security while observing the prince's instruction. George's piano teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was a patient woman in her 60s who had been working with the royal family for many years. She had a gentle but firm approach that seemed to bring out the best in her young student. James watched as George worked through a challenging piece, making mistakes and accepting correction with grace. When the boy struggled with a particularly difficult passage, He didn't become frustrated or try to hide his difficulty. Instead, he asked for help and listened carefully to Mrs. Henderson's guidance. "Excellent, Your Highness," Mrs. Henderson said after George successfully played through the troublesome section. "Remember, there's no shame in finding something difficult. The shame would be in not asking for help when you need it." The comment seemed to be directed at George, but James felt as though it had been meant for him. He was becoming increasingly aware of how the conversations and situations around Prince George seemed to reflect his own struggles, in ways that felt almost intentional. After the music lesson, James and George walked through the castle gardens for the prince's outdoor time. The boy was in an unusually reflective mood, stopping frequently to examine flowers or watch birds in the trees. "James, may I tell you something my father shared with me recently?" George asked as they sat on a stone bench overlooking the castle's rose garden. "Of course, Your Highness. He told me about a time when he was feeling very overwhelmed by his responsibilities. This was before I was born, when he was younger and still learning how to handle all the pressure of being in our family." George's voice was serious and thoughtful. He said he tried to handle everything by himself because he thought that's what strong people do. James found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested in where this story was leading. But eventually, he realized that trying to be strong all by himself was actually making him weaker. He was so worried about appearing perfect that he wasn't taking care of himself properly, and that meant he couldn't take care of the people who depended on him either. The parallel to James's own situation was impossible to ignore. The guard felt his chest tighten as he recognized the truth in the prince's words. "What did your father do?" James asked quietly. He talked to people he trusted. He admitted that he was struggling and asked for help. "And you know what happened?" George turned to look directly at James. People didn't think he was weak. They respected him more because he was honest and brave enough to get the help he needed. The boy's blue eyes were filled with compassion and understanding that seemed far beyond his years. James realized that Prince George was not just sharing a story about his father. He was offering James a roadmap for his own situation, presented with the wisdom and kindness that had become the boy's trademark. "Your father sounds like a very wise man," James said, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion. "He is," George agreed. "And he taught me that the people who care about us want us to be healthy and happy. They don't want us to suffer in silence just to protect their feelings." As they prepared to return inside, George made one final observation that would prove to be the catalyst for James's decision. "You know, James, I've been thinking about trust lately. I trust you to keep me safe because you're good at your job and because you care about me. But I also want you to trust me enough to know that I care about you too. Sometimes caring about someone means wanting them to get help when they need it, even if it means things might change." The words were delivered with the same gentle directness that characterized all of George's important conversations. The boy was essentially giving James permission to prioritize his own well-being, even if it meant stepping away from his protective duties. As they entered the castle, James realized that a 10-year-old child had managed to communicate something that trained counselors and concerned colleagues had been unable to convey. Prince George had shown him that seeking help was not a betrayal of his duties or a sign of weakness. Instead, it was an act of responsibility and courage that would ultimately serve everyone better. That afternoon, as James prepared for his security briefing, he found himself thinking not about the potential consequences of admitting his struggles, but about the wisdom and kindness that Prince George had shown him. The boy had given him something precious, the understanding that true strength sometimes meant acknowledging vulnerability and asking for support. The security briefing took place in a sterile conference room deep within Windsor Castle's administrative wing. James sat at the polished table alongside 5 other protection officers and 3 supervisors, including Chief Inspector Margaret Thompson, who had overseen royal protection for over 15 years. The agenda covered routine security updates, upcoming events, and personnel evaluations. James's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed his notes, and he found it difficult to focus on the presentations being given by his colleagues. His mind kept returning to his conversations with Prince George, particularly the boy's words about trust and caring enough to seek help when needed. When Chief Inspector Thompson called for individual reports, James felt his anxiety spike to nearly unbearable levels. His mouth went dry and he could feel perspiration beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. As his turn approached, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. "Chief Inspector," James said when Thompson called his name. "Before I give my operational report, I need to address a personal matter that affects my professional capabilities." The room fell silent. Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the unexpected deviation from standard procedure. James could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, but instead of shame, he found himself thinking about Prince George's courage in difficult situations. "I've been struggling with severe anxiety and depression for several months," James continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "It's affecting my sleep, my concentration, and my ability to perform my duties at the level required for royal protection. I believe it's in everyone's best interest for me to seek professional help and take a temporary leave from active duty." The silence that followed felt eternal. James had expected immediate dismissal or harsh judgment, but instead, he saw something unexpected in Chief Inspector Thompson's expression: relief. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Officer Mitchell," Thompson said formally. "Your honesty and professionalism in addressing this matter are commendable. We'll need to discuss the immediate logistics, but I want you to know that seeking help for mental health concerns is not only acceptable, but encouraged within our department." The conversation that followed was practical and supportive rather than punitive. Thompson explained the department's employee assistance programs, discussed temporary replacement arrangements, and assured James that his position would be available when he was ready to return. The other officers in the room offered their support, and several quietly shared their own experiences with stress and mental health challenges. As the meeting concluded, James felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he had been carrying. The decision to speak up had been terrifying, but the response had been far more positive than his anxiety-driven imagination had predicted. Later that afternoon, James had one final duty to complete before beginning his leave: informing Prince George about the change in his protection arrangements. This conversation would be the most difficult part of the entire process, as he had developed genuine affection for the boy and was concerned about how the news would affect him. He found George in the library, working on homework at a large oak table surrounded by books about British history. The prince looked up with his characteristic warm smile when James entered the room. "Hello, James, how was your meeting today?" The simple question, asked with genuine interest, nearly undid James's composure. He realized that Prince George had been thinking about him during what he knew was a stressful day. "Your Highness, I need to discuss something important with you," James began, taking a seat across from the boy. "I'm going to be taking some time away from my duties to focus on my health. Another protection officer will be assigned to you while I'm gone." George set down his pen and studied James's face carefully. The boy's expression was serious but not surprised, as if he had been expecting this conversation. "Are you going to get the help you need?" George asked directly. "Yes, Your Highness. I'm going to work with some doctors and counselors to address the anxiety and depression I've been experiencing." George nodded thoughtfully.
"I'm proud of you, James. I know that couldn't have been easy to decide." The simple statement, delivered with such sincerity and maturity, brought tears to James's eyes.
Here was a 10-year-old child expressing pride in an adult's decision to seek mental health treatment. The role reversal was both humbling and inspiring. "Your conversations with me over the past few weeks helped me understand that asking for help isn't weakness," James admitted. "You showed me that caring about the people around us sometimes means making difficult decisions." George's face lit up with a genuine smile. "I'm glad I could help, even a little bit. You've taken such good care of me, and I want you to take good care of yourself too." They talked for another 20 minutes about practical matters and about James's hopes for his recovery. George asked thoughtful questions about the treatment process and expressed confidence that James would return when he was ready. The boy's maturity and understanding made what could have been a heartbreaking goodbye into something more hopeful and positive. As James prepared to leave the library, George called out to him one final time, "James, will you promise me something?" "Of course, Your Highness. Promise me that you'll remember what you told me about the children at the hospital being brave. You're being brave too, and I hope you'll give yourself credit for that." The words followed James as he left Windsor Castle for what would be an extended absence. Prince George had managed to frame his decision to seek help not as a failure or retreat, but as an act of courage worthy of recognition and respect. That evening, as James began the process of arranging his treatment and temporary replacement, He reflected on the extraordinary wisdom and kindness that Prince George had shown throughout their relationship. A child who could have been spoiled or self-centered had instead demonstrated emotional intelligence and compassion that had literally changed the course of James's life. The boy's calm yet strong gesture of caring had indeed prompted James's resignation from active duty, but it had been motivated by love rather than criticism, by hope rather than disappointment. Prince George had given him the greatest gift possible, the understanding that his well-being mattered and that seeking help was not just acceptable, but necessary. 3 months into his treatment, James was beginning to experience the first signs of genuine recovery. The intensive therapy sessions, combined with carefully monitored medication, had helped him understand the root causes of his anxiety and develop healthier coping mechanisms. His sleep had improved dramatically, and the constant sense of impending doom that had plagued him for months was finally beginning to lift. Dr. Sarah Chen, his therapist, had helped him recognize that his struggles stemmed from a combination of accumulated stress, untreated trauma from a previous security incident, and an unhealthy perfectionism that had prevented him from seeking help earlier. The work was challenging and emotionally exhausting, but James was finally making meaningful progress. During one of their sessions, Dr. Chen asked James to reflect on what had motivated him to finally seek treatment. As he described his conversations with Prince George, the therapist was struck by the sophistication of the child's approach. "It sounds like this young prince demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence," Dr. Chen observed. "His ability to express concern without judgment, to offer wisdom without preaching, and to create space for you to make your own decision shows an unusual level of maturity." James nodded, feeling grateful once again for the boy's influence on his life. "He never made me feel weak or inadequate. Instead, he helped me understand that taking care of myself was actually part of taking care of him and doing my job well." Meanwhile, at Windsor Castle, Prince George was adjusting to his new protection officer, Detective Constable Emma Reynolds. Emma was a capable and experienced officer who had been thoroughly briefed on the prince's routines and preferences. However, the transition had been more difficult than anyone had anticipated. George found himself missing James's quiet presence and their meaningful conversations. While Emma was professional and kind, their relationship lacked the deep connection that had developed between George and James over 3 years of shared experiences. The prince's parents had noticed his subdued mood and arranged for him to speak with the palace chaplain about his feelings regarding James's absence. During these conversations, George expressed worry about his former protector's well-being and concern that somehow he had failed James by not helping him sooner. "Your Highness," the chaplain, Father Michael, said gently during one of their talks, "sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the space and encouragement to take care of themselves. From what you've told me, that's exactly what you provided for James." George considered this carefully, "but I keep wondering if I should have said something earlier, when I first noticed he was struggling." "That's a very caring thought," Father Michael replied. "But remember, healing happens on its own timeline. James needed to be ready to hear and accept help, and it sounds like your conversations with him came at exactly the right time." The chaplain's words provided some comfort, but George continued to think about James daily. He asked his parents for regular updates on his former protector's progress, and even dictated a letter expressing his hopes for James's recovery, though palace protocol prevented him from sending it directly. One afternoon, while working on a school project about acts of kindness throughout history, George had an idea. He approached his father, Prince William, with a proposal that surprised even the experienced royal. "Papa, I'd like to learn more about mental health awareness and how we can help people who are struggling," George announced during their weekly private time together. "I think it's important for people in our position to understand these issues." William was impressed by his son's thoughtfulness and arranged for George to have age-appropriate conversations with mental health professionals. These discussions helped the boy understand that his instincts about James had been correct and that his gentle approach had made a real difference. Dr. Amanda Foster, a child psychologist who consulted with the royal household, was amazed by George's insights during their conversation. "You seem to understand that helping someone often means creating space for them to help themselves," Dr. Foster observed. "That's a very sophisticated concept for someone your age." George nodded seriously. James taught me that people are usually doing their best even when they're struggling. I think the most important thing is to let them know they're not alone and that it's okay to ask for help. As the weeks passed, George began incorporating his new understanding of mental health into his other interactions. When his younger siblings seemed overwhelmed or upset, he applied the same gentle, non-judgmental approach he had used with James. When classmates at school appeared to be having difficulties, George made efforts to include them and offer friendship without being intrusive. His teachers noticed the change in his behavior, remarking to his parents that George seemed to have developed an unusual ability to create calm, supportive environments for others. The boy was becoming known among his peers not just as a prince, but as someone who could be trusted with worries and fears. Meanwhile, James's recovery continued to progress. He had reached a point where he could discuss returning to work, though both he and his treatment team agreed that he would need ongoing support and perhaps a modified role that would be less stressful than direct royal protection. During one of his final therapy sessions before beginning the return-to-work process, James wrote a letter to Prince George expressing his gratitude for the boy's wisdom and kindness. While he couldn't send it directly due to security protocols, the act of writing it helped him process the profound impact that their relationship had on his healing journey. "That child saved my life," James told Dr. Chen during their last session, not through any dramatic gesture, but through simple, consistent kindness and the courage to speak the truth with love. Dr. Chen smiled. "And in doing so, he taught you something important about how to treat yourself with the same compassion you would show to someone you care about." As James prepared to take the next steps in his recovery and potential return to work, he carried with him the lessons that Prince George had taught him about strength, vulnerability, and the power of caring relationships. The boy's calm yet strong gesture had indeed prompted a resignation, but it had also opened the door to healing and growth that would benefit everyone involved. The story of their relationship had become something beautiful, a testament to the way genuine care and wisdom can emerge from the most unexpected sources and create positive change that ripples far beyond the original interaction. 6 months after beginning his treatment, James stood outside the familiar gates of Windsor Castle, preparing for his first day back at work. His role had been modified based on recommendations from his treatment team and the palace security department. Instead of direct protection duties, he would be working in security coordination and training, a position that would allow him to use his experience while maintaining better work-life balance. The morning was crisp and clear, and James felt a sense of nervous excitement as he walked through the corridors that had once seemed so overwhelming. His therapy had not only addressed his anxiety and depression, but had also given him tools to manage stress and maintain his mental health going forward. Chief Inspector Thompson met him in the security office, welcoming him back with genuine warmth. "You look well, James," she said, reviewing his new assignment details. "We're grateful to have you back, and we're committed to supporting your continued recovery." The morning briefing included updates on all current security arrangements, including Prince George's protection detail. James learned that Detective Constable Reynolds had been doing excellent work, and that the prince had adapted well to the change, though several staff members had mentioned that he frequently asked about James's well-being. As James settled into his new routine, he found himself hoping for an opportunity to see Prince George and express his gratitude for the boy's role in his recovery. The chance came sooner than expected when he was asked to assist with a security review for an upcoming family event. James was reviewing camera positions in the castle's main corridor when he heard familiar footsteps and voices approaching. Prince George appeared around the corner with Detective Constable Reynolds returning from a morning walk in the gardens. The boy's face lit up with unmistakable joy when he spotted James. "James!" George called out, his composure briefly giving way to the excitement of an 11-year-old seeing a missed friend. He quickly caught himself and approached with more dignified steps, though his smile remained radiant. "Your Highness," James said formally, inclining his head in proper greeting. "It's wonderful to see you." Detective Constable Reynolds stepped back respectfully, allowing them a moment of private conversation while maintaining her professional vigilance. "You look much better," George observed, studying James's face with the same perceptive attention he had always shown. "Are you feeling better too?" "Yes, Your Highness. Very much better, thanks to the help I received and the wisdom you shared with me." James replied honestly. George's expression grew thoughtful. I'm so glad you got the help you needed. I was worried about you, but I also believed you were strong enough to get better. They talked for several minutes about James's new role and George's recent activities. The conversation had the same easy, meaningful quality that had characterized their relationship before, but now it was enhanced by mutual understanding of what they had been through together. James, may I tell you something? George asked, his voice taking on the serious tone that James remembered from their most important conversations. Of course, Your Highness. What you did by asking for help taught me something very important. It showed me that real courage isn't about never being afraid or never struggling. It's about being honest when you need support and trusting that people who care about you will help. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. Here was the child who had been his teacher, acknowledging that he had learned something from James's journey as well. You've taught me far more than I could ever teach you, James replied. Your kindness and wisdom helped save my life. George shook his head gently. I think we helped each other. That's what people do when they care about one another. As they prepared to part ways, George had one final observation that would stay with James for years to come. You know, James, I've been thinking about stars again. The book said that when stars form, they're created from cosmic dust and gas coming together under just the right conditions. Maybe people are like that too. Maybe beautiful things happen when caring and courage come together at exactly the right time. The metaphor was elegant and profound, perfectly capturing the essence of their relationship and its impact on both their lives. James realized that Prince George had not only helped him through his darkest period, but had also grown and learned from the experience himself. Over the following months, James thrived in his new position. His experience with mental health challenges made him an effective advocate for other officers struggling with similar issues, and he became instrumental in developing better support systems. Within the Royal Protection Unit, Prince George continued to demonstrate the emotional intelligence and compassion that had characterized their relationship. Teachers and family members noted his unusual ability to create supportive environments for others and his mature approach to discussing difficult topics. The boy's parents, recognizing his natural gifts in this area, began incorporating mental health awareness into his educational curriculum. George learned about the importance of emotional well-being and developed skills that would serve him well in his future role as a public figure and leader. Years later, when people asked James about the most important lesson he had learned during his career in royal protection, he would always think of Prince George. A 10-year-old child had shown him that true strength lay not in perfect composure or unwavering stoicism, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to seek help, and to trust in the healing power of genuine human connection. The story of their relationship became a quiet legend within the royal household, passed down as an example of how compassion and wisdom could emerge from the most unexpected places. Prince George's calm yet strong gesture had indeed prompted a resignation, but more importantly, it had prompted a transformation that touched many lives beyond their own. In the end, both James and George had learned that sometimes the greatest gift one person can give another is the permission to be human, to struggle, and to heal. Their story was a testament to the power of kindness, the importance of mental health awareness, and the extraordinary impact that one caring relationship can have on multiple lives.